My name is Harold Hal Whitaker, and I am 72 years old, a retired high school shop teacher who still smells pine before memory and makes coffee stronger than the place on Maple that misspells names. 2 weeks ago, at my son's promotion dinner, while I watched champagne fizz, my son reached into my coat pocket and took my house keys, smiled for the table, and announced I would be staying with them for a while to keep me safe. And that word wrapped around me like plastic and tasted like rust. So I said nothing and chewed my steak and let the humiliation sit like a nail between my teeth. Because a carpenter learns when to tighten and when to wait for the wood to settle. Before we go further, let me introduce everyone so you know the shapes in this story. My son is Marcus Whitaker, 34, polished real estate agent with starched cuffs, a talent for selling air as if it were walls. Charming in public and controlling in private. My daughter-in-law is Vanessa Whitaker, 32, a lifestyle micro-influencer with immaculate taste, a person who arranges lemons like prayers and sees me as a brand risk. My granddaughter is Lily Whitaker, 6, a bright-eyed comet with a sketchbook, fearless with crayons and kinder than most adults. My next-door neighbor is Rosa Alvarez, 68, retired nurse, Puerto Rican grandmother to the whole block, equal parts spice and backbone. The kind of woman who waters plants and rumors with equal accuracy. My attorney is Priya Desai, 41, an estate and elder law hammer in a silk blouse, unimpressed by swagger and deeply impressed by documents. My younger brother is Leonard Lenny Whitaker, 69, former band roadie turned antique dealer, estranged from me over a years-old argument about our father's toolbox and the meaning of an A-. My friend at the community center is Tom Chun, 45, patient social worker who teaches kids how to hold a tool and themselves at the same time, and Officer Carla Ruiz, 38, the neighborhood's community liaison cop who knows every dog's name and most of their owner's secrets. Now, back to the night of the keys. After dinner, Marcus guided me to his SUV the way a salesman guides a buyer toward leather seats, talking about decluttering, staging for safety, and unlocking equity. And Vanessa promised a heart-healthy routine, while handing me beige adaptogen tea that tasted like a broken promise. In their guest room, a white duvet with corners, too crisp to comfort. There was a book about decluttering your mind by decluttering your life, which is a polite way of telling you to throw your history out so their house looks bigger. Late that first night, from the hallway, I heard Marcus murmuring about evaluations and assisted living and timing the market, and I heard Vanessa say we should get ahead of the narrative. And I realized they weren't talking about my safety so much as their storyline. The next morning, Lily padded in with star and strawberry socks and asked to draw a castle on my arm. And when I told her a dragon sneezing could set the curtains on fire, she laughed in a way that made the room warmer and reminded me June, my late wife, always inhaled before a joke like music was borrowing her lungs. Soon a man in a blue windbreaker arrived to test me. Recite the date, count backward by sevens, draw a clock at 10 after 11. List animals that start with B. I gave him bison, baboon, badger, beagle, bluebird, beetle. Drew a clock with a private joke where the squeaky third stair should be, and signed my name the way I taught kids to sign theirs when they built bookcases. The evaluator left smiling. My son beamed to the imaginary audience Vanessa keeps in her phone, and I went to the garage to find the old toolbox my father gave me, and I gave Marcus, and discovered it polished for photos, but empty of everything but a cracked tape and a pencil nub, which is enough for a man who knows what to measure. I called Rosa on video, and her face filled the screen like a full moon, and she said she'd water my peonies and watch the front porch and count the strangers who tried to make my place pretty. Then I went home for a supervised collection of a few things, and found a stager with shoes that cost more than my table saw belt and words like dated but charming. And I slipped into my workshop, the one I poured and framed and roofed myself. Opened a hidden drawer I built the year Lily was born and touched the original will, the deed, June's cursive note, and a velvet bag holding a brass spare key heavy enough to remind a man gravity still believes in him. Lily squeezed in through the gate with a lion backpack and a map she'd drawn with stars marking important places, including my shop, and I told her we had to add the tomato patch because messy is just delicious before you taste it. Inside, the stager laid a white duvet where my quilt used to be. Vanessa arranged lemons again. Marcus talked comps and Rosa stood on her porch with a watering can and a saint's patience. Later, Marcus placed a color-coded calendar titled House Transition in front of me like a treaty, and I told him it looked like the blueprint for a house I didn't want to live in. And he told me I'd thank them later, and maybe someday I will thank someone, but not for this. That night, I watched moonlight lay a square on the counter where my keys sat, and I picked them up and felt the teeth like a mountain range. Then, set them back because I'm not a snatcher by nature. I'm a builder. The next day, Officer Ruiz dropped by to check on me. Rosa's whisper travels faster than Wi-Fi, and she handed me a card and reminded me that people confuse helping with handling. And if I ever needed a wellness check for myself, I should call her. And by the way, her father, Eddie Ruiz, still has the A- bookcase I graded for a back that wasn't square. And we laughed because a minus can make a person better at the community. Center Tom asked me to fix a stripped vise, and the shop smelled like sawdust and second chances, and I remembered the version of myself who wore chalk on his sleeves and thought summer was for sanding and kids can learn patience with a rasp. Back at my son's house, I called Priya Desai, the lawyer whose office door I once repaired, and asked, hypothetically, what a father should do when a son pockets a father's keys and begins to speak for him to evaluators and stagers and the entire internet. And she said the father should write everything down, get medical records from his own doctor, gather friends who can attest to his functioning, stop asking for permission in houses he built, bring original documents before any practice open house, and, if he plans to take back more than the keys, build not just a plan but a moment that makes a room go quiet long enough for a signature to dry. I looked at the calendar taped to the guest room wall and at my reflection, older and slower in some mornings, but no less the man who left the third stair squeaky for 30 years because June and I liked the sound of our home clearing its throat, and I decided I would measure, mark, and cut as I always have, with patience and accuracy and an eye for grain. Quick audience check before we roll on. Where are you watching from? Kitchen table with a teacup ring, bus stop between shifts, porch that knows your weight, living room floor with a kid drawing castles. Tell me your city. Tap, follow, join. Our community that believes dignity isn't something someone can pocket. It's something you keep even when the room says guest. All right, back to it. My son still has my keys. My house still breathes like a chest under a tight belt. June's teacup ring is a ghost on the mantle. The third stair still sings, and I am counting backward by sevens for the evaluator and forward by days on their calendar, writing down dates, stray sentences, the phrases aging in place and unlocking equity, and for now. And while I won't tell you the shape of what happens next, I will tell you this. I built a workshop with my hands. I taught half this block to drill a straight pilot hole, and every quiet person carries a blueprint for a bridge no one else knows is missing, and I have started mine. Monday arrived like a hand on my shoulder saying up you get, and I decided I would spend the day gathering proof the way I used to gather measurements. Slowly, carefully, nothing crooked. I booked my own appointment with my primary doctor, the one who has watched my knees go from cocky to cautious and who still remembers June's laugh because it rattled the curtain rods. And I told Marcus I wanted to take a walk alone first, and he looked at his watch and said 10 minutes fine, and I nodded and walked 3 blocks. Turned left at the bakery, and right into the clinic, where I asked for cognitive screening and records printed on paper you can hold, sign, and show to a person who thinks your memory is the same as your malleability. I aced the test not because I like trivia, but because my brain still knows the difference between a bird and a beetle and knows what day it is when someone tries to sell it a different calendar. And when the nurse handed me the stamped documents, I slid them into a thick manila envelope that felt like a rib cage around a heart. Back at the house, Vanessa was staging something she called morning light with a stack of linen napkins and a bowl of green fruit that looked expensive and inedible. I laid my envelope on the counter like a placemat she didn't know how to remove gracefully. And when she asked what that was, I said recipes, and she smiled and told her followers we're doing generational knowledge today. Then turned the phone toward my hands, and I smiled and showed the outside of the envelope and said nothing else. Sometimes silence is a hinge that lets a door swing only when you are ready. I called Priya and told her I had proof of capacity. She said, good, bring it, and also bring the deed and any old will. And I said I would, and she said come before noon if you can because the notary likes to take lunch at 11:30 and guard her pen like a dragon after that. I asked Marcus to drop me at the hardware store, said I wanted to walk down memory lane, And he said cute and drove me. But I walked past the paint swatches and sliding miter saws and straight through the store to the door that leads out back, where Priya's office building hunkers like an old teacher waiting at the end of the hall. Inside her office, I handed over the envelope, the deed, the will from my hidden drawer, and June's note. And Priya read like a carpenter reads grain, slow and with respect. She asked which outcomes I wanted, and I told her I wanted to keep my house, my workshop, my dignity, and the ability to sleep with my windows open without worrying a relative would sell the air while I dreamed. She nodded and drew a rectangle on her legal pad and wrote trust across it in block letters, and inside, in smaller handwriting, she wrote the workshop stipend, the roof fund, the utilities, the clause about the community tool library that would carry June's name and mine. And then in the margin, she wrote a conditional pathway for Marcus, a string tied around a finger so he could find his way back if he remembered how to use his hands for help instead of hustle, 1,000 volunteer hours. Alongside Tom at the community center, documented, supervised, and with a line on the sign-in sheet for humility. She smiled at that last part and crossed it out and wrote attendance instead because the law likes its words cold. And I signed where the notary told me to sign, and the pen felt heavier than it looked, and the ink looked like something permanent, like the way pine darkens after 10 years of sun. On the way out, I bought a cheap flip phone at the corner store for cash, something without an app that could talk behind my back, and I saved 3 numbers in it: Rosa, Tom, and Officer Ruiz. And I felt like a teenager holding a secret walkie-talkie under the covers. That night, I texted Rosa and asked if she had the old doorbell camera her nephew had replaced last summer. And she wrote back with 3 thumbs up and an address emoji, and when we got to her porch, she dug in a drawer that could have held a raccoon and came up with the camera and a tangle of wire, and said if you can make it talk again, you deserve everything you get. And I took it home and made it talk again with 2 screws, a charger, and a little patience. In the workshop. I say workshop though I wasn't allowed there on paper. In reality, I knew every window latch and hinge like a handshake, and the side door wanted me more than any calendar did. I set up the doorbell camera facing the bench, not to catch thieves of tools, but to catch thieves of stories, and I placed a little digital recorder near the back door, because I had a feeling Vanessa's house tour would someday wander where she had not been invited. Then I walked the perimeter of my property and noted every loose picket and squeaky latch, every nail proud of the wood, and I fixed only one thing: the third stair inside, because I wanted one old habit to go quiet for reasons that were mine, not theirs. I planed and shimmed and set a new screw a half hair to the left of where the oak wanted to split, then stepped up and down 9 times and waited and smiled when it kept its peace. A small private ceremony that felt like taking a stone out of my shoe. Marcus was accelerating. His voice on the phone sounded caffeinated when he told me the stager wanted pre-listing photos by Friday, that he had an agent authorization for me to sign so he could shield me from stress, and that he booked a practice open house on Saturday for a few friends in the business to walk through and give pointers. I asked him to explain practice open house, and he said it's like a dress rehearsal, and I said I like rehearsals because that's when mistakes admit they exist. And he chuckled and told me I was funny and brought over a stack of documents to sign. I put on my glasses, not because I needed to, but because the gesture buys you time, and I read and found language that would have let him accept offers on my behalf if I didn't respond within 24 hours, and another clause that referred to me as the seller in the third person as if my voice were a rumor. I tapped the page with my forefinger and said I need to think, and he sighed and tried a new tactic. Dad, I'm trying to protect you. And I said me too and slid the papers back, and he left to make a call in the hall, and Vanessa leaned in and whispered, if you sign, we can get your place on the local home tour. And I said thank you for the incentive, and she mistook my politeness for softness, which is everyone's favorite mistake about quiet people. I made lists. Who knew what? Who owed me nothing yet offered help? Who owed me everything yet demanded more? Rosa would be my lookout and my alibi. Tom would be my anchor and witness. Officer Ruiz would be the professional who knows process better than theatrics. Priya would be the spine under the skin of the moment. And Lily, sweet Lily, would be protected from all of it. I put her drawings in a folder with a note that says for later because revenge should not splash onto children no matter how easy it would be. On Thursday, I went to the community center with Tom and spent the morning teaching a boy named Hector how to square a box with a diagonal measurement instead of eyeballing it. He told me his mother works 2 jobs, and he wants to make her a nightstand, so she has a place to charge her phone that isn't the floor. And I said, then we will make a nightstand. And we cut, sanded, and dry fit the pieces. And when Hector saw the joint snug without force, he said it clicks. And I said, yes, that's the sound of right. And I wished my son would come hear it, but I didn't invite him because you cannot teach someone who wants to be the whole room. Tom asked if everything was on track, and I told him we had a rehearsal Saturday and a performance soon after. And he said he would be there with 2 volunteers who can keep calm when others can't. And I thought of my students who used to freeze at the sight of their own mistakes, and I reminded myself to breathe how I taught them to breathe. Steady, hands open, nothing sudden. Friday morning, Vanessa arrived with a photographer in a hat so wide it could shade a small country, and she orchestrated citrus bowls and throw blankets and my late wife's absence like a producer. I stood in the corner and watched the photographer catch angles that had nothing to do with living and everything to do with gloss. And when Vanessa said, "Could you step out of frame? The vibe we're going for is minimal," I stepped out and gave her all the minimal she wanted, which meant I was behind the door when she whispered to the photographer, "He doesn't even know we're listing next week. The evaluator is writing unsafe. This will be the easiest close of the year." And the photographer said, "Wow," and Vanessa said, "We're doing the right thing," and the recorder in my pocket said, "Thank you. I'll hold that for later." After they left, I called Priya and told her we had a whisper. And Priya said, "We don't need whispers when we have documents. But whispers number the rooms for the jury that lives in everyone's head." In the late afternoon, Lenny texted me for the first time in years. Rosa must have told him something, because his message said, "Heard a storm's coming. Got a tarp if you need one." And I wrote back, "I might." And he sent a photo of our father's old toolbox with a caption, "Still has the smell," and I stared at the screen a long time. Then asked if he could come by Saturday morning to help me move a heavy thing. And he replied with a thumbs up and a skull because that's his idea of humor. And a moment later, he wrote, "Sorry about all that old noise," which is the closest either of us has come to apology since the night we argued about whether Dad meant for me to keep the Stanley number 4 or for us to share it like brothers share the last slice of pie. I told him to meet me at the shop at 9 and bring the tarp. Saturday began with a sky the color of primer, and the air smelled like a room before a coat of paint. I put on the only suit I owned because I wanted to look like the man who taught, repaired, signed permits, paid taxes, married June under a trellis I built, and carried a toolbox through 3 generations. Vanessa posted a story about Sneak Peek Day with sparkles around the word, and Marcus texted me a thumbs up and a reminder to be flexible. And I texted back, "I am a master of flexibility. I carry a hinge in my pocket." And he sent a laugh emoji and wrote, "Love you, Dad." And I wrote, "Same." Because love and disappointment sometimes ride in the same car, and you can't throw one out without the other grabbing the wheel. People started arriving for the practice open house, as if the word practice made grabbing a stranger's memories polite. There were agents in sharp shoes and friends of Vanessa who call everything a vibe, and I watched from the sidewalk with Rosa on my arm, as if we were going to a parade. And at exactly 10, Priya pulled up, stepped out with a folder tucked to her heart, and nodded to me once. Officer Ruiz arrived second in her unmarked car, hair pulled back, expression neutral like a straight edge, and Tom came third with 2 volunteers in center t-shirts, one big as a refrigerator, the other small as a lamp, but with eyes that saw corners. At 9:59, Lenny appeared carrying the tarp like a magician, bringing his own curtain, and I hugged him, and he hugged me back stiffly, and I smelled the ghost of cigarettes and a decade of antique polish, and thought, all right then, we are here. I had not told you my moment yet because it needed to grow bones, but now it had them. We walked into my house not like a raid and not like a party, but like people walking into a shop to do a job. And when Vanessa saw us, she lifted her phone automatically and then lowered it because Priya in a suit makes people put cameras down. And Marcus came forward with his smile loaded like a staple gun and said, "Dad, what's this?" And I said, "Rehearsal, like you said." And he said, "Of what?" And I said, "Of something that will require everyone to listen." And then I asked the photographer for a favor. "Could you keep your camera rolling? Because I might want a copy for the family album." And she blinked at Vanessa, and Vanessa nodded because she believed her own script. And I felt the floor steady under my feet like a deck screwed to joists. And though the performance wasn't for 5 more minutes, I could hear the room practicing its silence for when the curtain would lift. I could feel the brass spare key in the velvet bag inside my jacket, brushing my ribs with each breath as if reminding me that when the time came I would not just take back keys, I would take back the doors they promised. And I told myself, easy, Whitaker, measure twice, cut once, and let the seconds pass like sand through a clean hourglass that nobody gets to turn without asking. At 10:05 the room had learned how to be quiet, the way a classroom goes still when the teacher lifts a hand without raising a voice. Marcus stood near the mantel rehearsing a smile that has closed 100 deals. Vanessa hovered by the kitchen island with her phone face down like a holstered weapon. The photographer watched the light on the white duvet. Rosa folded her arms like a guardrail. Tom and his two volunteers took positions by the hallway and the back door. Officer Ruiz leaned against the entry, and Priya flipped open a folder that looked ordinary until you saw how everyone unconsciously leaned away from it. I thanked the guests for coming to a practice and said we would keep it short, then looked at my son and asked for my keys. And he laughed too quickly and said, "Dad, we'll talk after." And I said, "Now, please." And the room waited to see which word would win, later or now. I told Marcus that words like safe and proactive sound generous until they sit next to words like authorization and seller, and he started to say he was only trying to help when Priya stepped forward and introduced herself, then set a stack of stamped documents on the table. My physician's cognitive evaluation showing capacity, dates, signatures, the notary's ink like small thunderclaps. She explained that any power of attorney Marcus believed he had was both expired and improperly executed, that no agency relationship existed that would let him accept offers or list my home without my explicit written consent, and that an elder is not a prop in a branding exercise no matter how well lemons are arranged. I felt the room tilt back toward level. Vanessa recovered first, picked up her phone, and started to frame a speech about compassion. So I pressed the small recorder I had carried all week and let the room listen to her whisper from the rehearsal chute. "He doesn't even know we're listing next week. The evaluator is writing unsafe. Easiest close of the year." And the sentence dropped like a wrench. The photographer's eyes widened in a way that said she would prefer not to be part of a plot. Officer Ruiz cleared her throat and said, "For the record, the city takes reports of potential financial exploitation seriously, but we are here to keep this civil and factual wrapped around us like decent weather." I put both palms on the kitchen island June once leaned against and said, "This house is not inventory. It is the place where my wife is still alive and the squeak of a stair I fixed yesterday for my own reasons. It is the workshop where I taught children how to make true things square. It is the porch where my neighbor watered my grief when I forgot how. And I am not signing away fresh air so someone else can duct it into a different filter." I looked at Marcus and said, "You may return my keys now." And he hesitated just long enough to show the room that he was measuring not right and wrong but wins and losses, then reached into his pocket and dropped the key ring into my hand with a metallic rattle that felt like a pulse returning. I slipped the ring into my jacket and took out the velvet bag, held up the brass spare I had cut from my father's old blank, and told him, "This one is mine. It always has been." And he nodded once like a boy at the end of a lesson he didn't want but understood. Priya laid down the next layer, not a threat, but a structure. Earlier in the week, she and I had executed a living trust that placed the house and the workshop into a fund bearing the Whitaker name, with explicit instructions that the property was not to be transferred, encumbered, or listed without the trustee's consent, my consent, and that the shop would be converted into the Whitaker Workshop, a nonprofit program attached to the community center with a small stipend and a roof fund so the lights stay on and the saw blades stay sharp, and with a gift in June's name to seed a neighborhood tool library. The room absorbed the words nonprofit and trust the way wood absorbs oil, darkening where truth soaks in. I added one more beam. The trust included a conditional path for Marcus.